The dust kicked up from the wagon wheels as it rolled into Fort Apache on that hot summer day in 1885. Thomas McKenna gripped his leather satchel tighter, his knuckles white from the long journey from Boston. At 28, he had never been this far west, never seen mountains like these, and certainly never been around so many different kinds of people. The fort was busy with soldiers, traders, and Apache people coming and going. Thomas tried not to stare, but everything was so different from his quiet life back east. He had spent most of his adult years bent over maps and charts, measuring distances and drawing lines on paper. Numbers and measurements made sense to him. People, especially women, did not. "You the map fellow from back east?" asked Captain Williams, a weathered man with tired eyes. Thomas nodded and followed him toward a small building that would serve as his office and sleeping quarters. "We need these land boundaries settled proper," the captain continued. "Been having disputes with the Apache about where their territory ends and ours begins. Your job is to measure everything exact, make maps that nobody can argue with." Thomas unpacked his instruments carefully. His transit, his chains, his notebooks. These were the tools he understood. He had been making maps since he was 16, first as an apprentice, then on his own. But he had always worked alone, measuring empty fields and forest boundaries back in Massachusetts. This was different. This land had people on it who cared deeply about every hill and stream. The other men on the surveying team were rough types who laughed loud and drank whiskey in the evenings. They made jokes about Thomas's quiet ways and how he turned red whenever women walked past. "McKenna's never even talked to a girl proper," one of them said during dinner his second night there. "Look how he gets all nervous just when that Mexican lady serves the food." Thomas ate his beans in silence, wishing he could disappear into his maps. It was true, he had never courted anyone, never even held hands with a woman. His mother had died when he was 12, and his father, a stern professor, had raised him to believe that books and learning were more important than socializing. The next morning, Thomas began his work. He needed Apache guides to show him the boundaries their people recognized, so he could compare them with what the government claimed. That's when he first saw the Apache camp. It spread across a valley near the river, with dozens of traditional dwellings mixed with some newer structures. Children ran between the buildings playing games he didn't recognize. Women worked at various tasks, their movements efficient and purposeful. Men sat in groups, talking in their language that sounded like music to Thomas's ears. He set up his transit on a nearby hill and began taking measurements, but found himself watching the daily life below. Through his telescope, he could see an elderly woman teaching young girls to weave. A group of men were training horses. Smoke rose from cooking fires as families prepared their evening meals. Thomas pulled out a small sketchbook he kept for rough drawings of terrain features. But instead of drawing hills and rivers, he found himself sketching the scene below. A woman grinding corn, children playing with a dog, an old man carving something from wood. His guide, a middle-aged Apache man named Joseph, noticed the sketches. "You draw our people," he said in careful English. Thomas felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean any disrespect. They seemed so..." He struggled for words. "Peaceful," Joseph finished. "Yes, we are peaceful. Here. But government men usually only see us as problem to solve." "I'm not government exactly," Thomas said. "I just make maps. I try to show things as they really are." Joseph studied him for a long moment. "Maybe you different kind of white man." Over the next few days, Thomas continued his measurements, but always with one eye on the Apache camp. He noticed patterns in their daily life that fascinated him. How they moved with the sun, how different families had different responsibilities, how even the youngest children seemed to have important jobs. He also noticed one woman in particular. She was younger than most, maybe in her 20s, with long black hair that caught the light. She moved with confidence, talking easily with both older women and men. Thomas found himself looking for her each morning when he set up his equipment. One day, while he was adjusting his transit, she appeared near his work site. Thomas nearly dropped his notebook when he saw her walking up the hill toward him. She stopped about 20 feet away and spoke in Apache to Joseph, who had been helping Thomas understand the traditional boundary markers. She asks why you draw. Pictures of our people, Joseph translated. Thomas's mouth went dry. The woman's eyes were dark and intelligent, and she was looking directly at him, waiting for an answer. I don't know, he stammered. I mean, I do know. It's just, your people seem so real, so connected to this land. When I draw the boundaries on maps, I want to remember that real families live here, that this isn't just empty space to be divided up. Joseph translated, and the woman nodded slowly. She said something else in Apache. She says most white men see our land as empty, waiting for them to fill it up. But you see it already full of life. The woman looked at Thomas one more time, then walked back toward the camp. Thomas watched her go, his heart beating faster than it had during his entire journey west. That evening, he couldn't concentrate on his calculations. He kept thinking about her steady gaze, how she had listened to his words being translated, how she had nodded as if she understood something important about him. You seem distracted, Map Man, Joseph said the next morning as they prepared to measure a disputed water source. I keep thinking about what she said, about the land being full of life. Joseph was quiet for a while as they walked. Finally, he said, her name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom in our language. She is daughter of Red Hawk, who speaks for our people in meetings with your government. Is she? Thomas started, then stopped, embarrassed by what he was about to ask. Married? No. Many warriors have asked, but she says none see her as she wishes to be seen. She is very particular about choosing. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to say more. He had never thought about marriage for himself. His life was orderly, predictable, safe, but something about this place, about seeing Ayana that first time, made him wonder what other kinds of life might be possible. Over the next week, Thomas threw himself into his work with new purpose. He wanted his maps to be perfect, not just accurate but somehow respectful of the people who called this land home. He spent extra time talking with Apache elders about their traditional territories, learning not just where boundaries were, but why they mattered. And sometimes, when he was working near the camp, Ayana would appear. Never close enough to talk, but close enough that he could see her watching him work. Each time, Thomas felt that same flutter of nervousness and excitement. He had come west to make maps of the land. But as his first month at Fort Apache came to an end, Thomas realized the territory he was really exploring was inside himself. For the first time in his careful, quiet life, he was beginning to wonder what it might feel like to be truly known by another person. The land around Fort Apache was vast and complex, full of hidden valleys and ancient trails. But Thomas was discovering that the human heart might be even more mysterious territory to navigate. And for a man who had spent his life avoiding such complications, that was both terrifying and strangely thrilling. 2 months had passed since Thomas arrived at Fort Apache, and his careful measurements were causing quite a stir. The government men had expected him to confirm their version of the land boundaries, but Thomas's honest work was telling a different story. McKenna, we need to talk. Captain Williams called him into the fort's main office one morning. Several other officials were there, including a territorial representative who had ridden in from the state capital. Your maps show the Apache land extending further east than we claimed, the territorial man said, pointing at Thomas's carefully drawn charts. This creates problems with settlers who already built homes in that area. Thomas cleared his throat nervously. Sir, I can only report what I measure. The boundary stones the Apache elders showed me are clearly marked and quite old. Some appear to be from Spanish colonial times. Maybe those stones got moved, suggested another official. No, sir, Thomas said quietly but firmly. I checked them. Against multiple references, they're authentic, and they're exactly where the Apache say they should be. The room fell silent. Thomas could feel the tension building, but something inside him refused to back down. These weren't just lines on a map anymore. These were boundaries that affected real families, real lives. We'll discuss this later, Captain Williams finally said. There's a formal meeting with Apache leaders tomorrow to try to settle this boundary dispute. You'll present your findings then. That evening, Thomas sat in his quarters, reviewing his measurements for the 100th time. Everything was accurate. He had double-checked every calculation, verified every landmark, but he knew his honest report might not be what anyone wanted to hear. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Joseph, his Apache guide, stood outside. Red Hawk asks if you will come to our camp tonight, Joseph said. He wants to hear your findings before tomorrow's meeting. Thomas had never been inside the Apache camp after dark. He grabbed his maps and followed Joseph down the path, his heart beating fast from nervousness. The camp was peaceful in the evening light. Families sat around small fires, sharing meals and quiet conversation. Children played games in the shadows. It felt more like home than anywhere Thomas had been since leaving Boston. Red Hawk's dwelling was larger than most, reflecting his position as a leader. Inside, several elders sat in a circle. Ayanna was there too, sitting beside her father. Thomas tried not to look directly at her, but he could feel her presence like warmth from a fire. My daughter speaks English well, Red Hawk said through Joseph's translation. She will help us understand your words. Ayanna moved closer to the center of the circle. We have heard that your measurements show different boundaries than the government claims, she said in careful but clear English. Thomas was surprised by her voice. It was softer than he had expected, but confident. Yes, that's correct. The traditional markers your people showed me indicate the boundary runs about 3 miles east of where the government placed it. Red Hawk spoke in Apache and Ayanna translated. My father asks if you will change your report to match what the officials want. Thomas looked around the circle at the weathered faces watching him. These were people who had lived on this land for generations beyond counting. No, he said firmly. I won't change the truth. The boundaries are where your people say they are. A murmur went around the circle. Red Hawk nodded slowly and spoke again. He says you are either very honest or very foolish, Ayanna translated, but she was almost smiling. Maybe both. Probably both, Thomas admitted, which made several of the elders chuckle. They spent the next hour going over the maps together. Thomas showed them exactly what he had measured, and the elders confirmed various landmarks and their significance. Ayanna translated back and forth, but Thomas noticed she sometimes added explanations beyond the direct translation, helping both sides understand each other better. This stone here, she said, pointing to one of Thomas's markers. It was placed by my great-great-grandfather when he made peace with the Mexican settlers. It has his mark carved into it. Thomas leaned closer to see what she was showing him on the map. For a moment, their shoulders almost touched, and he caught the scent of sage and wood smoke in her hair. His hand trembled slightly as he pointed to the corresponding spot on his chart. I documented that carving, he said. I didn't know its history, but I could tell it was important. When the meeting ended, the elders began to leave, but Ayanna lingered. Walk with me, she said simply. They stepped outside into the cool night air. The fort's lights twinkled in the distance, but here among the Apache dwellings the world felt quiet and peaceful. Why did you tell the truth about the boundaries? Ayanna asked as they walked slowly between the buildings. Thomas thought, for a moment, because lies don't make good maps, and because your people trusted me to see what was really there. Even if it causes problems for you, especially then. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. Thomas had never felt so easy talking with a woman before. But something about Ayanna made conversation feel natural. Tell me about your life before this place, she said. So Thomas found himself talking about Boston, about his father's bookish world, about spending years bent over drafting tables making maps of places he'd never seen. I always drew what other people told me was there. This is the first time I'm mapping land I can actually walk on. And what do you see that's different? Thomas stopped walking and looked around the camp. Life, connection, people who belong to their place instead of just living on top of it. Ayanna nodded thoughtfully. Your people see land as something to own. My people see ourselves as belonging to the land. Maybe that's why your maps usually show empty spaces where we see home. They had reached the edge of the camp, where the Yo path led back toward the fort. Thomas knew he should return, but he didn't want this conversation to end. Tomorrow's meeting will be difficult, Ayanna said. The officials will pressure you to change your report. I know. And you still won't change it? Thomas looked at her in the moonlight. Her face was serious, but somehow encouraging. No, I won't change it. Good, she said softly. A man who tells the truth even when it's hard. That's the kind of man worth knowing. The next morning, Thomas entered the meeting room with his maps and his resolve. Government officials sat on one side of a long table, Apache leaders on the other. Tension filled the air like smoke. Thomas spread out his charts and began explaining his findings. As he had expected, the territorial representative interrupted him repeatedly, questioning his methods and suggesting alternative interpretations. These measurements could be off by several degrees, the man argued. Surveying equipment isn't perfect. Sir, I've checked my work multiple times with different instruments, Thomas replied. The margin of error is less than 50 feet, not several miles. Redhawk spoke up, with Ayanna translating. My father says his grandfather showed him these same boundaries when he was a boy. The markers have been there longer than any white settlement in this territory. Indian memory isn't the same as legal documents, another official protested. Thomas felt his temper rising, which was unusual for him. With respect, sir, their Indian memory includes physical evidence I can measure and document. That's more reliable than documents drawn up by people who never set foot on this land. The room erupted in heated discussion. Through it all, Thomas noticed Ayanna watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't exactly approval, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. The meeting ended without resolution, as everyone had expected. The officials needed time to consider Thomas's findings and their implications. But as people filed out of the room, Ayanna approached his table. You spoke well today, she said quietly. You didn't let them make you doubt what you know to be true. Thomas looked up from gathering his maps. I had good teachers, he said, meaning the Apache elders who had shared their knowledge with him. And you were a good student, she replied. Someone who listens with respect. There was something different in her voice, something that made Thomas's pulse quicken. For the first time since arriving at Fort Apache, he felt like someone truly saw him. Not as the quiet map maker from back east, not as the government surveyor, but as himself. That evening, as Thomas worked on his detailed report, he found himself thinking less about boundary lines and more about the way Ayanna had looked at him across that tense meeting room. He was beginning to realize that measuring the land around Fort Apache had led him to discover territories within himself that he never knew existed. And the most surprising discovery of all was that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what he might find there. 3 weeks after the boundary meeting, life around Fort Apache had settled into an uneasy peace. Thomas's honest survey had created complications, but it had also earned him unexpected respect from both communities. The Apache elders now greeted him warmly when he passed through their camp, and even some of the fort's officers had begun to see the value in having a surveyor who couldn't be bought or pressured. Thomas had grown comfortable with his daily routine of measurements and mapping, but he had also grown comfortable with something else, his evening conversations with Ayanna. What had started as brief encounters had become something he looked forward to more than anything else in his carefully ordered life. She would appear near his work site in the late afternoons, sometimes bringing water or simple food to share. They would talk about the land, about their different worlds, about books when she discovered he had a small library in his quarters. Thomas learned that she had been educated by missionaries as a child and could read English better than many. How the soldiers at the fort. I like the stories about faraway places, she told him one evening as they sat on a hill overlooking both the Apache camp and the fort. But I never wanted to leave here. This land holds too much of who I am. Thomas understood that feeling now in a way he wouldn't have when he first arrived. "I never felt connected to any place before coming here," he admitted. "Boston was just where I happened to live." "And now?" He looked out over the valley, with its mix of traditional Apache dwellings and military buildings, the mountains rising beyond like ancient guardians. "Now I think I understand what you mean about belonging to a place." Their conversations had grown easier over the weeks, but Thomas still felt tongue-tied whenever Ayanna smiled at him or sat close enough that he could smell the sage she used to wash her hair. He had never learned the art of talking to women, had never needed to. But with her, words seemed to come naturally, as if she created a space where he could be himself without fear. One morning, Joseph approached Thomas with unusual formality. "Red Hawk calls for gathering tonight. Important matters to discuss." Thomas had learned that formal gatherings were significant events, not casual meetings. "Should I attend?" "You are invited, as friend of the people." That evening, Thomas arrived at the Apache camp to find it buzzing with activity. More people were present than he had ever seen together. Elders from other bands, warriors in their finest clothing, women dressed in their best beadwork. Whatever was happening tonight was important. The gathering took place in a large open space in the center of camp, with fires providing light and warmth against the cool mountain air. Thomas sat with other honored guests, feeling both privileged and nervous about being included. Red Hawk stood and began speaking in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. Thomas caught a few words he recognized, but mostly he watched the faces around him, trying to understand the significance of what was happening. After several minutes, Red Hawk's tone changed, becoming more personal. He gestured toward where Ayanna sat with other unmarried women, and Thomas felt his stomach tighten with sudden understanding. "He speaks of his daughter," Joseph whispered in translation. "Says it is time for her to choose a husband, that she has waited long enough." Been too particular in her standards, Thomas's mouth went dry. He watched as Red Hawk continued speaking, occasionally gesturing toward the group of Apache warriors who were clearly potential suitors. 3 young men sat straighter when their names were mentioned, their faces proud but respectful. Then Red Hawk stopped speaking and stepped back. The gathering grew quiet as all eyes turned to Ayanna. She rose gracefully, her long hair catching the firelight. For a moment she looked around the circle, her gaze passing over the assembled faces. When her eyes met Thomas's, she held his gaze, for just a heartbeat longer than the others. Then she began to speak. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily to every person in the gathering. Thomas couldn't understand her words, but he could hear the determination in her tone. She spoke for several minutes, occasionally gesturing, once pointing toward the 3 Apache suitors. But then she turned and pointed directly at Thomas. A gasp went through the crowd. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as every person in the gathering turned to stare at him. Surely he had misunderstood what was happening, but Joseph's shocked whisper confirmed his fears. "She chooses you. She says the white mapmaker has shown more honor than many warriors, more truth than government officials, more respect for our ways than most of her own people." Thomas tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't work properly. Around him, the Apache. People erupted in discussion, some voices angry, others surprised, a few supportive. The 3 rejected warriors looked stunned, though not angry. In Apache culture, a woman's choice in marriage was respected, even when it was unexpected. Red Hawk raised his hand for silence. When the crowd quieted, he looked directly at Thomas and spoke a few words. "He asks if you accept his daughter's choice," Joseph translated, his own voice shaking with disbelief. Thomas finally managed to stand, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Every face in the gathering was focused on him, waiting for his answer to a question he had never imagined being asked. He looked at Ayanna, who watched him with steady confidence, as if she had no doubt what his answer would be. The firelight played across her face, and in her eyes he saw not just invitation, but challenge. She was asking him to step into a life completely different from anything he had ever imagined. Thomas started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. I am honored beyond measure by your daughter's choice, but I know nothing about being a husband, especially in your culture. I don't know if I'm worthy of such trust." Joseph translated, and Red Hawk's stern expression softened slightly. He spoke again. He says worthiness is not about knowledge, but about character. His daughter sees something in you that she values more than tradition or comfort. Thomas looked around the circle again. Some faces showed hostility, others curiosity. A few showed what might have been approval. This decision would affect not just him and Ayanna, but both communities. It could create problems, stir up tensions, complicate the delicate peace they had all been working toward. But then he looked at Ayanna again, and none of that seemed to matter. "Yes," he said, his voice stronger now. "If she will have me, I accept." The gathering erupted again, but this time Thomas barely heard it. Ayanna smiled at him across the fire-lit space, and in that smile was promise and challenge and something that made his chest tighten with emotions he had no names for. Later, as the formal gathering broke up into smaller groups discussing this unexpected development, Thomas found himself surrounded by Apache men asking questions about his intentions and his ability to provide for a wife. Their examination was thorough but not hostile. They were taking the measure of a man who would become part of their extended family. "You know this won't be easy," Joseph said during a quiet moment. "Many people in both communities will have opinions about this marriage." "I know," Thomas replied, "but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Even though you know so little about marriage, about our ways, about what this choice will mean for your future." Thomas watched Ayanna across the gathering, deep in conversation with her aunts and female cousins who were no doubt asking their own questions about her surprising decision. "Especially because I know so little. She's choosing to teach me, to trust me to learn. How could I be anything but honored by that?" As the evening wound down and people began returning to their homes, Red Hawk approached Thomas with formal dignity. "My daughter has made her choice known publicly, as is our way." Joseph translated his words. "Now you must make your choice known to your people at the fort. If you truly accept, there can be no hiding, no shame. A marriage between our peoples must be honest and open, or it serves no one well." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of what lay ahead. Tomorrow he would have to face Captain Williams and the other fort officials, tell them that their quiet surveyor intended to marry an Apache woman. There would be consequences, maybe loss of his position, certainly loss of respect from some quarters. But as he walked back toward the fort that night, Thomas realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't calculating risks and seeking the safest path forward. Instead, he was walking toward something that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Behind him, the Apache camp settled into peaceful quiet. Ahead of him, the fort's windows glowed with lamplight. And somewhere between the two worlds, Thomas McKenna was discovering what it meant to choose love over safety, connection over solitude, and an unknown future over a predictable past. The shy man who had arrived from Boston 6 months ago would never have imagined himself in this situation. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that the most important territories to explore were not marked on any map, but found in the courage to say yes when life offered something completely unexpected. The morning after Ayanna's public declaration, Thomas woke before dawn, his stomach churning with nervousness. Today he would have to face Captain Williams and the other fort officials with news that would shock them almost as much as it had shocked him. He dressed carefully in his cleanest clothes and walked to the captain's office, his hand slightly trembling as he knocked on the door. "McKenna, come in," Captain Williams called. "I heard there was some kind of commotion at the Apache camp last night." "Everything peaceful?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Sir, I need to inform you of a personal matter that may affect my position here." The captain looked up from his papers, his expression becoming more attentive. "Go on." "Red Hawk's daughter, Ayanna, has chosen me as her husband. I've accepted her proposal." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Captain Williams stared at Thomas as if he had announced his intention to grow wings and fly. You're going to marry an Apache woman? The captain finally asked. Yes, sir. Do you understand what that means, McKenna? The complications it will create? The problems with Washington when they hear about this? Thomas had thought about little else since the previous evening. I understand it won't be easy, sir, but I also understand that she's offering me something I never expected to find. A real partnership with someone who sees value in who I am. Captain. Williams leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas with new interest. You've changed since coming here. When you first arrived, you could barely look people in the eye. Now you're telling me you're going to marry into the Apache tribe. This place changes a man, Thomas said simply. And she changes me most of all. After a long pause, the captain nodded slowly. Well, it's not illegal, though it's certainly unusual. And you've done good work here, honest work that's helped keep peace between the communities. If this marriage can strengthen that peace, he shrugged. Just know that some people won't approve. I understand, sir. When's the ceremony? In 2 weeks. There will be both Apache traditions and a Christian blessing if we can arrange it. Captain Williams was quiet for another moment. I'll speak to Chaplain Rodriguez. He's a good man, not quick to judge. If anyone can help you bridge the religious differences, it's him. Thomas felt a wave of relief. He had expected much worse opposition from the military leadership. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Ayanna's female relatives took charge of planning the Apache portions of the ceremony, while Thomas worked with Chaplain Rodriguez to incorporate Christian elements that would satisfy his own conscience and background. During this time, Thomas and Ayanna spent their evenings together talking about practical matters, where they would live, how they would blend their different customs, what their daily life might look like. Are you frightened? Ayanna asked one evening as they walked along the river. Thomas considered the question honestly. Terrified, he admitted. I've never even courted a woman properly, let alone married one. I don't know how to be a husband. I've never been a wife either, she said with a smile. We'll learn together. But you chose me over warriors who know your culture, who understand your world completely. Ayanna stopped walking and turned to face him. Those warriors see me as a prize to be won, a woman to be possessed. You see me as a person to be known. That's why I chose you. The wedding day dawned clear and warm. The ceremony would take place at sunset, in the space between the Apache camp and the fort, symbolically joining the two communities. Thomas dressed in his finest clothes, his hands shaking as he tried to tie his necktie. Joseph had offered to stand with him as a witness, bridging the gap between best man and cultural interpreter. You ready for this? Joseph asked as they walked toward the ceremony site. No, Thomas said honestly. But I'm going anyway. The gathering was smaller than the night of Ayanna's declaration, but still included representatives from both communities. Red Hawk had invited the Apache families who supported the Union, while Captain Williams had come with several officers, who had grown to respect Thomas's work. Ayanna appeared at sunset, wearing a beautiful dress that combined traditional Apache beadwork with a style that wouldn't look out of place in a Boston church. Her hair was braided with silver and turquoise ornaments that caught the last light of the day. Thomas forgot to breathe when he saw her. The ceremony itself was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Red Hawk spoke first, in Apache, welcoming Thomas into the extended family and explaining his new responsibilities as Ayanna's husband. Then Chaplain Rodriguez offered a Christian blessing, speaking about love, partnership, and the courage required to build a life together. Finally, following Apache custom, Ayanna and Thomas each spoke their own vows. I choose you not because you are Apache or white, but because you are honest and kind and see beauty in things others overlook. Ayanna said, her voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. I trust you with my heart and my future. Thomas's voice shook as he replied, I promise to honor your choice to learn your ways while staying true to my own, and to love you with all the courage I can find. He paused, then added, You've taught me that the best maps aren't drawn on paper but discovered by walking the territory together. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, they were declared married by both traditions, the celebration that, Followed included Apache drumming and singing, along with fiddle music from some of the soldiers. Two worlds came together in music and laughter, at least for one evening. Later, as the festivities continued around them, Thomas and Ayanna slipped away to the small house that had been prepared for them, a structure that blended Apache and Anglo building techniques just like their marriage was blending two cultures. Inside, by lamplight, they faced each other as husband and wife for the first time. "I don't know what I'm doing," Thomas whispered, his nervousness obvious. "Neither do I completely," Ayanna replied softly. "But I know we'll figure it out together." She moved closer, reaching up to touch his face gently. "You're shaking." "I've never. I don't know how to." "Shh." She placed a finger against his lips. "We have all night. We have all our lives. There's no hurry." What followed was tender and patient and completely different from anything Thomas had ever imagined. Ayanna guided him with gentle touches and whispered words, showing him that intimacy was not something to be conquered but something to be shared. She was understanding about his inexperience, even amused by his earnest attempts to do everything perfectly. "You think too much," she whispered at one point, her breath warm against his ear. "Feel instead of thinking." And gradually, Thomas learned to stop calculating and start trusting. Trusting her guidance, trusting his own responses, trusting the connection that had brought them to this moment. When they finally lay quietly together afterward, Thomas felt as if he had discovered an entirely new country, one that existed in the space between two people who had chosen to know each other completely. Was I? He started to ask, still worried about his performance. "Perfect?" Ayanna finished with a soft laugh. "No. But perfect isn't what I wanted. I wanted real. I wanted you." They talked quietly until near dawn, sharing stories about their childhoods, their fears, their dreams for the future. Thomas learned that Ayanna had worried about whether she was making the right choice, whether love could bridge the gap between their different worlds. "And now?" he asked. "Now I think the gap wasn't as wide as I feared. We're more alike than different. Both trying to be honest, both willing to learn, both looking for something real in a complicated world." As the first light of morning began to filter through their window, Thomas held his wife close and marveled at the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he had been a lonely bachelor whose greatest intimacy was with his surveying instruments. Now he was a married man, part of an Apache family, building a life that combined two cultures in ways he was still discovering. The shy surveyor from Boston was gone forever, replaced by a man who had learned that the most important territory to explore was not marked on any map, but found in the courage to open his heart to another person. Outside, the world was waking up to the reality of their marriage, with all the challenges and changes it would bring. But inside their small house, Thomas and Ayanna had created something new together, a partnership based on respect, patience, and the kind of love that grows stronger when two people choose to face the unknown side by side. The map of their future was still being drawn one day at a time, but Thomas had never been more confident about the territory they were exploring together. 5 years had passed since the shy surveyor from Boston married the Apache woman who chose him before her entire tribe. The Thomas McKenna who now walked through the bustling town of Apache Wells bore little resemblance to the nervous young man who had once dropped his instruments whenever a woman walked past. Apache Wells had grown up around the original fort, becoming a trading post and settlement where Apache families, Mexican traders, Anglo settlers, and military personnel conducted business with mutual respect rather than suspicion. Much of that peaceful cooperation could be traced back to one couple who had proven that two different worlds could not only coexist, but create something beautiful together. Thomas stood in his surveying office, now the largest such business, in the territory, reviewing maps with a client, a Mexican rancher who needed accurate property lines established for a land purchase. Through the window, he could see his 5-year-old son, David, playing in the street with children from 3 different cultures, switching easily between English, Spanish, and Apache as he played. "Papa," Mama says, "come home for lunch," called his 3-year-old daughter, Catherine, as she burst through the office door. She had inherited her mother's dark hair and her father's analytical mind, along with a fearless confidence that amazed Thomas every day. "Tell Mama I'll be there soon." "Little bird," Thomas replied in Apache, which made Catherine giggle. She loved it when he spoke her mother's language, especially since he had worked so hard to learn it properly. Thomas finished his business with the rancher and walked home through streets that felt truly like home for the first time in his life. His house was larger now, built in a style that combined adobe construction techniques with New England interior layouts. It housed not just his growing family, but often served as neutral ground for resolving disputes between different community groups. He found Ayanna in the kitchen, preparing a meal that blended ingredients and techniques from both their backgrounds. She had become known throughout the territory as someone who could help mediate conflicts, translate not just languages but entire ways of thinking about problems. "How was your morning?" she asked, rising on her toes to kiss his cheek. "Good. The Rodriguez family wants to expand their ranch eastward, and I need to survey the boundary with Apache grazing lands. Should be straightforward. Everyone involved wants a fair solution." "That's because they know you'll find the truth, not what they want to hear," Ayanna said with a smile that still made Thomas's heart skip after 5 years of marriage. Their relationship had deepened and strengthened through the challenges they had faced. The first year had been difficult, as they learned to navigate not just marriage, but the reactions of people who disapproved of their union. Some Apache families had initially questioned whether Ayanna was abandoning her heritage, while some Anglo settlers had treated Thomas as if he had betrayed his own race. But gradually, their quiet example had changed minds. Thomas's continued success as a surveyor, combined with his genuine respect for Apache knowledge and customs, had earned him acceptance in both communities. Ayanna's work as a translator and cultural bridge had made her invaluable to territorial officials who needed to understand Apache perspectives on various issues. After lunch, while the children napped, Thomas and Ayanna sat together on their front porch, enjoying a few minutes of quiet conversation. "Joseph stopped by this morning," Ayanna said. "He brought news from the Apache bands to the south. They're having boundary disputes with new settlers, and they want to know if you'd be willing to do survey work for them." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. His reputation for honest, accurate work had spread throughout the territory. Apache leaders now specifically requested him for surveys involving their land, knowing he would document the truth regardless of political pressures. "It means traveling for several weeks," Ayanna continued. "The children and I could come with you, make it a family expedition. Would you want to? It would be rough traveling, camping out most nights." Ayanna laughed. "Thomas McKenna, I was born in a teepee and didn't sleep in a permanent house until I was 15. I think I can handle camping with my family." These expeditions had become family adventures over the years. David and Catherine were growing up with an understanding of the land that combined their father's scientific approach with their mother's cultural knowledge. They could read topographical maps and identify edible plants with equal skill. That evening, after the children were in bed, Thomas sat at his desk working on a project that had occupied his spare time for the past 2 years. A detailed record of Apache history and customs as told to him by the tribal elders. What had started as personal curiosity had become something much larger. "You're writing again," Ayanna observed, settling into the chair beside his desk with her own work. Beadwork that would be sold to traders traveling east. Red Hawk told me another story today about the ancient boundaries between different Apache groups. I want to get it recorded properly before the old ones who remember are gone. Ayanna looked over his shoulder at the pages covered with his neat handwriting and detailed sketches. "You know, when I chose you that night, I never imagined you'd become the keeper of our stories. I never imagined I'd become anything other than a man who made maps," Thomas replied. "But it turns out the most important maps are the ones that show how people connect to places and to each other." His documentation project had already attracted attention from territorial historians and government ethnologists. Thomas had been careful to get permission from Apache leaders before recording their stories, and he always shared his writings with them to ensure accuracy and respect. "The territorial governor wants to publish some of these accounts," Thomas said. He thinks they could help other government officials understand Apache perspectives better. What do you think? Thomas set down his pen and considered the question. I think knowledge shared respectfully can build bridges, but I worry about people using these stories for purposes we never intended. Then we make sure the sharing happens on our terms, Ayanna said practically. You publish what we choose to share, with the understanding that this knowledge comes from real people with real lives, not museum specimens. A few months later, Thomas received word that his boundary survey work was being recognized at the territorial level. The governor wanted to meet with him about establishing better surveying standards throughout the region, standards that would take into account traditional land use patterns as well as legal documentation. It's a chance to influence how all future surveys are done, Thomas explained to Ayanna as they discussed the invitation. To make sure other surveyors understand that accurate maps require understanding the people who live on the land. You, should go, she encouraged. You've learned something important here, something that could help prevent conflicts elsewhere. The meeting in the territorial capital went better than Thomas had expected. Government officials had begun to realize that his approach to surveying, taking time to understand traditional land use, consulting with local people, documenting cultural as well as legal boundaries, actually prevented more problems than it created. McKenna's surveys hold up in court better than anyone else's, the territorial attorney general explained to the assembled officials. Nobody can dispute his accuracy, and his methods reduce conflicts between different groups competing for land rights. When Thomas returned home from the capital, he found Ayanna teaching a group of Apache children to read English, while David and Catherine helped by reading aloud from simple books. The scene represented everything their marriage had accomplished. Two cultures sharing knowledge, children growing up comfortable in multiple worlds, understanding expanding rather than contracting. How did it go? Ayanna asked after the lesson ended and the children had run off to play. They want to make our approach the standard for territorial surveys, Thomas said. Fair documentation, consultation with local people, respect for traditional knowledge alongside legal requirements. Our approach? Thomas smiled. I told them I couldn't take credit for methods I learned from my Apache teachers. They want to establish training programs where experienced surveyors like me teach others how to work respectfully with different communities. That evening, as they sat together watching their children play in the yard, Ayanna took Thomas's hand. Do you ever miss your old life? The quiet, predictable world you had in Boston? Thomas looked around at the life they had built together. The house that reflected both their heritages, the children who belonged fully to both cultures, the community that had learned to see diversity as strength rather than threat. I miss the simplicity sometimes, he said honestly. Life was certainly easier when I only had to worry about my own thoughts and feelings. But I wouldn't trade this complexity for anything. You taught me that the most important discoveries come from exploring unknown territory even when it's scary. And what's the most important territory you've explored? Learning how to love and be loved, Thomas replied without hesitation. Learning that connection is more valuable than safety, that understanding others enriches rather than threatens who you are. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold,